A century ago, Britain ruled over a quarter of the planet. In this series, I will go in search of Britain's imperial past.
I have found gold.
And uncover its legacies. How did a small island on the edge of Europe end up dominating the world?
He turned a miserable group of accountants into swashbuckling pirates.
From its proudest achievements to its most shameful failures.
We're ripped away from Mother Africa into a strange land.
And how has the history of empire transformed Britain?
We became the black people of Britain.
On this journey, I uncover the extraordinary story of the biggest empire that the world has ever seen. In this program, I discover how Britain's empire was built by pirates.
They were given permission from the King of England to plunder, and plunder they did.
How millions were ripped from their homelands and stripped of their identities.
I cannot say exactly where I'm from. I just can't trace that back.
And how the descendants of those men and women altered Britain. The trade in enslaved Africans, uprooting millions from their homeland and transporting them across the Atlantic, drove the early development of the British Empire. At the empire's sunset, the descendants of some of those slaves gravitated towards Britain at the empire's heart. Another migration, another adaptation for them, but this time changing Britain into the multicultural country that it is today. This is the story of a tiny island that redefined what it means to be British. Jamaica, the Caribbean island of lush green mountains, coral reef beaches, and sleepy fishing villages. A small tropical country that plays an outsized part in Britain's imperial history. And here, beneath the waves of Kingston Harbour, an extraordinary piece of empire lies hidden. The lost city of Port Royal. On the 7th of June, 1692, 2,000 people died when the sandy peninsula on which Port Royal was built slid into the sea during an earthquake. The impact can still be seen today underwater. Barnacled walls mark out the edges of forgotten streets. You can just make out the rooms in which people lived over 300 years ago. People whose lives were unexpectedly cut short. The town lies beneath the water now, preserved like a submarine Pompeii, yielding insights into how the British exercised mastery of the seas at the opening of their imperial adventure. Who were these early empire builders and why did they come to a remote island so far from home? Doric Gray is the former executive director of the Jamaica National Heritage Trust.
Port Royal literally sits on a sand spit. And when the earthquake occurred, there was a process of liquefaction. The sand turned quicksand, and the buildings went down vertically. The walls fell in on some, and some of the other walls fell out. It's also a burial site. 2,000 people died instantly. What happened on that day, on the 7th of June, 1692, is locked in a time capsule underwater.
Why is this town underwater? so valuable to our understanding of those times?
In 37 years, Port Royal became the most important English city in the Americas. So most of the site is preserved. It is still there. There's still a lot of information that we can learn about not only Jamaica, but about ourselves.
The sunken city is slowly yielding its secrets, including the surprising identity of those who transformed England into an imperial power. In the middle of the 17th century, Spain, with its extensive colonies, was the world's superpower. Spain dominated the Americas, whereas England had only a few trading posts in North America and the Caribbean, all of them private ventures. But that was about to change under the leadership of a man with a plan. Oliver Cromwell, having beheaded and replaced the English king, sent the first English state-sponsored colonial expedition across the Atlantic with the aim of seizing those parts of its empire that a now decaying Spain could not defend. The first piece of land captured from the Spanish was Jamaica in 1655. The indigenous Taino had been all but wiped out, and there were barely 2,000 people on the island. Peter Gordon is a former officer in the Jamaican Coast Guard. In Port Royal, his family goes back generations.
The British didn't waste any time in building this fort because they had taken it so easily from the Spaniards, they didn't want the same thing happening to them. So they almost immediately, within a year, build this fort.
It was one thing to seize Jamaica, another to hold it. This new colony needed sea power to protect it. As England's navy was overstretched, the task was outsourced to an unlikely quarter. Having expelled the Spanish from Port Royal, the English feared a counterattack, which they were ill-equipped to repel. The resourceful first governor, Edward D'Oyly, had a solution. He invited buccaneers from nearby Tortuga, present-day Haiti, to make the town their home port, from which these Spanish-hating pirates could harass Spain. Peter, tell me about these buccaneers that were brought in by Edward D'Oyly.
I'm afraid most people tend to regard them as pirates. I willingly embrace them as buccaneers because I know they were given permission from the King of England to plunder. And plunder they did.
Did these people have a particular grudge against Spain?
Everybody had a grudge against Spain because she wanted to keep everybody off these lands.
We romanticize pirates from Peter Pan to Pirates of the Caribbean, but actually they were a very bloodthirsty lot.
They did what they had to do to enrich themselves. They could do as they pleased, and they did.
A license to kill.
Exactly.
When the English gave these pirates the mark, the stamp of official approval, was there any limitation to what these guys could do?
Well, in the case of Morgan, there was absolutely none. The man took full advantage.
Henry Morgan was the pirate master of the smash and grab. On behalf of England's start-up empire, Morgan tormented the Spanish, weakening the threat that they posed to Britain's imperial ambitions. And how do you Jamaicans feel about this, this huge figure with a lot of scallywag running through him?
We are of different stock here in Port Royal. We embrace Henry Morgan because many of us, generations through the years, came out of these cutthroats and robbers.
Henry Morgan transformed the fortunes of Port Royal. On one raid alone, he brought back the equivalent today of £155 million. Port Royal became a powerful English naval base, and with its riches, gained a reputation as the wickedest city on earth. Fundamentally, British Jamaica was founded on theft. It had been seized from the Spanish, and they in turn before that had grabbed it. And Jamaica depended on buccaneers who were violent for its defense and its economy. By the time Port Royal was drowned by earthquake and tidal wave, a new age was dawning. The empire was turning away from piracy and the theft of gold to the plunder of human beings. Enslavement on an industrial scale. After Port Royal, dubbed the wickedest city on earth, was sunk by earthquake, a new chapter in the history of empire began, with Jamaica at its center. The old Port Royal dockyard became the headquarters of the British Navy in the Caribbean. It would become one of the biggest naval bases in the world. These old buildings evoke that imperial past. This old naval hospital is quite recent when you think how far the Royal Navy's connection with Jamaica goes. Built in 1818 and making use of the most modern technology, an iron-framed building. And the extraordinary thing is how it has survived numerous earthquakes, any number of hurricanes, although in fact a hurricane in the 1980s left it pretty dilapidated and destroyed the outer buildings. Early in its existence, the Royal Navy discovered the importance of having naval surgeons and even hospital ships to treat scurvy and injuries and dehydration. And then when they came to the tropics, they would suffer from malaria and yellow fever, and the men would be treated in wards like this. And you can be absolutely assured that many a Royal Navy sailor breathed his last in this room. At the end of the 17th century, the Royal Navy was on a path to becoming the world's most powerful sea force. For the brigands and scoundrels who'd done Britain's dirty work on the high seas, time was running out. One of the last English pirates of the Caribbean was John Rackham, alias Calico Jack, credited with being the inventor of that symbol of piracy, the Jolly Roger. In 1720, he was captured, brought to the Admiralty Court of Port Royal, and hanged. His body was then suspended in chains at the entrance to the harbour, at a place now known as Rackham's Quay, as a warning to everyone that piracy, which had once been endorsed by the British authorities, was now strictly prohibited. The beginning of the end for the pirates had come with the Treaty of Madrid in 1670. This was a watershed moment for the empire because the Spanish recognized England's American colonies. But the price to be paid was to end the use of anti-Spanish pirates. I've come to meet historian Jonathan Greenland to ask how such a deal could be done between imperial rivals.
The Spanish suddenly decide that they have to come to peace with England because the privateering and the piracy were wrecking their economy. They gave England a sweet deal. They basically said, but we recognize all your territories in the Western Hemisphere as long as you stop this piracy.
having agreed to end piracy, did they actually do so?
Yes, they hung quite a lot of pirates, anybody who was caught in the act, because suddenly they discovered something even better than piracy: sugar. People were making far more from sugar than they would be making from piracy anymore. Far more.
Sugar cane, first brought to the Caribbean by Christopher Columbus himself, thrived in the tropical conditions of Jamaica, with its plentiful supply of sun and rain. The fertile land would be a magnet to those willing to risk their lives to make their fortunes. I'm approaching Stokes Hall. Luke Stokes had been governor of Nevis, another Caribbean colony. But after the fall of Port Royal to the British, he spied an opportunity in Jamaica. In an extraordinary piece of logistical organisation, he arrived with 1,600 people. But adventuring in the tropics was a risky business, and Stokes and his wife soon succumbed to disease. Stokes had chosen to settle in the east, in the area of the Plantain Garden River, one of the most fertile in Jamaica. But the conditions that made it good for sugarcane also made it a breeding ground for the mosquito. 2/3 of the 1,600 people who came with Luke Stokes would die from malaria and yellow fever. For the early colonists, this was also a lawless land. Coming to Jamaica, I didn't expect to find anything as old as this and as substantial. It feels like a baronial hall. It also has the feeling of being defensible territory. The thing has the feel of a castle. Of course, to resist hurricanes and earthquakes, you'd want great thick walls, but these are enormous. And while it's true that a proper castle wouldn't have windows, what proper castles do have are arrow slits. And here are slits all over the place. Not for arrows, of course, but a place where maybe a person could position himself with a gun and resist those who were coming up the hill. Despite the risks of this frontier territory, the lure of sugar was irresistible. Sugar was the developed world's new drug. And as the appetite for tea took off, so did the craze to sweeten it. One man who saw the business potential was Henry Morgan. The same Henry Morgan who'd amassed a fortune in piracy. Jonathan Greenland has offered to show me the inventory of Morgan's possessions at the time of his death.
Henry Morgan was a self-made man. He went from being a soldier to becoming a pirate. Then he eventually became Governor General of Jamaica. And then his last chapter of his life, he became a very successful sugar planter. A lot of it is sort of borne out by this inventory. This is an inventory of Henry Morgan's property. Most important things are the amount of stuff he had. A lot of jewelry, a lot of, things which, just demonstrated wealth, gold and silver. And then he also had a velvet saddle. I don't know whether that would be very much use. And then more kind of interestingly here, 44 Negro men, 42 Negro women.
And they, of course, these people are just listed amongst his other properties.
They are just listed as property, exactly.
And why was the combination of sugar and slavery so extraordinarily lucrative for people like Henry Morgan?
People like Henry Morgan could, purchase human beings at price and then have them as their personal property. And then they would work their plantations and make a lot of money.
Sugar made such commercial pioneers wealthy. But it also set up a triangular trade that enriched and empowered the emerging empire. Jamaica's sugar molasses was shipped to Britain, and the profits were used to purchase goods to take to West Africa. Those were bartered for enslaved Africans, who were transported to the Caribbean and sold to Jamaica's sugar planters. The system created vibrant colonial economies while filling the coffers of the British Crown. But what was the human cost of this imperial trade? Professor Veront Satchel is an historian who's descended from enslaved Africans.
The vast majority would have been coming from the west of Africa, say from that area around Nigeria, Ghana.
Were they sold on arrival?
Yes, it would be advertised in the newspaper. They're having this auction, they would be auctioned off, and it would be done by scramble.
Scramble?
Yes. When the day of that auction would be taking place, the planters would be advised and they would go to the market, and at an opportune time, the slaves would be placed onto, say, a platform. And the planters would just rush up and grab a number, or just bundle a number of slaves. That's scramble.
You're kidding.
So that would be, and that can be traumatic, isn't it?
Describe the life of enslaved people on an estate like this one.
Wow. If the slave finds himself or herself working in the fields, their work would be extremely difficult because they would have to be plowing with their hoes the stiff soil just to prepare the soil. And that's backbreaking.
All of this, the slave trade, slavery, wars, all driven by the sweet tooth.
All driven by the sweet tooth in Europe. That is the power of sugar.
With rocketing demand for sugar across the globe, Jamaica became an engine room of empire, creating wealth and power for Britain. But it depended on violence and suppression, and therefore lived in fear of revolution. Jamaica, once the home of the indigenous Taino, looks very different today. Many of its population are descended from enslaved Africans, ripped from their homelands and stripped of their identity. The islanders are who they are as a result of empire. The story of how that came about is one of extraordinary economic success at woeful human cost. It's well illustrated here at the lavish and elegant Good Hope Estate. Here lived John Tharp, at the start of the 19th century, probably the richest man in Jamaica. Having inherited 2 estates from his father, he shrewdly amassed 10 enormous sugar plantations covering 16,000 acres with 3,000 enslaved workers. It was said, with a little exaggeration, that he could ride across the island without ever leaving his own land. This estate stands as a striking example of the extraordinary fortunes that could be created on the plantations. It may not be appropriate even to show appreciation for the architecture of a plantation owner whose estate depended on enslaved people, but this has been brilliantly created. The house expresses both its owner's status and taste. Bedrooms on the ground level, benefiting from the marvelous circulation of air. This floor, 200 years old, made of Jamaican orange wood, and as good as the day it was laid. And here, a splendid map of Good Hope Estate, the parish of Trelawney, Jamaica, 1794. Here, the river, without which there would not have been a plantation because it gave power to the mill. Here's the little bridge. So on one side would be the wheelhouse, the mill, and the factory. The bridge, the river, and the wheelhouse are still here today. I'm meeting Jamaican heritage expert O'Shane Robinson to find out what life was like for those who toiled to create the sugar fueling the empire. O'Shane, an enormous water wheel, and I suppose this was at the very heart of the sugar manufacturing process.
Yes, it's within these structures that the sugar cane would have been crushed so that the juice can be extracted and then transported over across the river.
Over that rather fine bridge?
Yes.
Where would the mill actually have been? Where would the turning pieces have been?
The mill is on the other side.
The mill is where the cane is crushed. So in here you would have found the rollers, would you?
Yes, the rollers would have been like this, and the sugar cane would have been fed through it. The juice would have then been extracted.
Are we talking about a crowd of enslaved people in here?
Yes. Now imagine operating for close to 24 hours with little to no break, and you're there just pushing sugar cane to get all the juice out of the cane. And then one of your fingers accidentally get caught in the rollers. It would then pull you in. And as it pull you in, there would have been somebody on standby that would have a machete to sever your hand from your body so that the production would not stop, because production was valued more than the lives of the slaves.
Here at Good Hope, I begin to grasp the scale of what was required to meet the growing taste for sugar in Britain and the human cost. In 1662, 7 years after Jamaica had been conquered by the British, there were 554 enslaved people in the colony. Just over a century later, there were more than 400 times that number, more than 200,000 people in this island alone. The success of the British Empire required the mass movement of peoples across the oceans. Starting in 1662, the British transported 3.5 million men and women from Africa across the Atlantic to be sold into slavery. Had I looked down on one of the harbours on this coastline in the early 19th century, I might have seen up to 20 vessels at any one time, decanting their cargo of Africans who'd crossed the Atlantic in chains and loading sugar and rum bound for Britain and its empire. That extensive colonial trade, based on slavery, was protected by Britain's extraordinary asset, the most powerful fleet in the world. Slavery has been practiced throughout human history. Africans have enslaved other Africans. North African Barbary pirates put white Christians into bondage. Arab traders seized vast numbers of Africans and shipped them eastwards. The European abduction and transport of Africans across the Atlantic was truly massive and systemic, and in that sense, exceptional. But increasingly, voices were raised against slavery. The transport and trade of enslaved people would be abolished throughout the British Empire in 1807, but slavery itself remained legal. There were sporadic rebellions in Jamaica and elsewhere. Reprisals were swift and brutal. In the run-up to Christmas 1831, a rumour circulated that the king had at last decided to set free the enslaved people of his empire. And when that turned out not to be true, all hell broke loose here. It would be the most widespread rebellion in Caribbean slave history. Tens of thousands of enslaved people set fire to plantations. White authority and the empire's livelihood were under attack. The uprising was blamed on the Baptist Church of Jamaica, founded by former enslaved Africans. Nearly 200 years ago, there was a small chapel where this modern church now stands. Lay preacher Leon Jackson can tell me about how its Baptist minister, William Knibb, led a rebellion against the system of slavery on which the empire was built.
William Knibb described slavery as one of the worst things that could ever happen to human.
William Knibb came to Jamaica as a missionary at the age of 21.
So he wrote to his mother back in England that he was going to work towards ensuring that slavery would no longer exist.
And the enslaved people, how did they feel towards William Knibb?
First, they weren't trusting of William Knibb, because and along comes a white man looking like the slave owner and trying to befriend them. They thought it was a trick, but William Knibb was tenacious. And soon they began to trust him. And the trust was aided by the fact that the slave owners didn't like William Knibb.
You think this rebellion had an impact on Parliament in London?
Yes, it did. It forced them to move closer towards emancipation. It gave them the feeling that, yes, if we don't give emancipation now, something worse than a rebellion is likely to happen.
In Britain, the campaign against enslavement was led by an evangelical Anglican, William Wilberforce, and taken up by others. Slavery was finally outlawed throughout the British Empire by the Abolition Act of 1833.
On that night, when the slaves were going to be freed, right here in this church, the slaves made a make-believe coffin. In it, they put the shackles, the handcuffs, the whips, and everything. As it got closer to 12 o'clock, all the 2,000 slaves gathered in and around this church, and they started at about 10 minutes to 12. The monster is dying. The monster is dying. The monster is dying. And when the clock struck 12, they all got up in unison and shouted, "The monster is dead!" And they took up that make-believe coffin and they buried that coffin.
How Parliament was persuaded over decades to abolish first the trade in human beings and then, in the face of rebellions, slavery itself, is an epic. But in the British Empire, it was the slave owners who were compensated, whilst the enslaved people, as they achieved their freedom, were left to fend for themselves on an island whose economy had depended on their servitude. It was no longer legal for one human being to own another. But that did little to eliminate the hardships of the formerly enslaved. In many ways, their lives got worse, not better. I'm talking to historian Veront Satchell again.
Emancipation was just, well, giving the former slaves freedom in the sense that they were no longer bondsmen or they were no longer chattels. They were now seen as human beings, but they were still being treated as inferior subjects.
What sort of problems had persisted in Jamaica?
With emancipation, the slaves who had this land free for years now found themselves having to pay rent for the land as well as rent for their huts. And the wages, quote unquote, that we're getting couldn't cover all of those costs.
How would you describe the legacy of this period of slavery in Jamaica today?
Bob Marley's song, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. We are still suffering from that psychological trauma, that lack of confidence in some of us. We were, as children of enslaved people, were dragged out, ripped away from Mother Africa to the Americas. Suddenly, leaving family, friends, taking nothing with us but our cultural baggage into a strange land, in a strange culture, strange language, strange everything. You have lost part of you. I cannot say exactly where I'm from. I just can't trace that back. I don't know where in Africa, West Africa, yes, but where? Where's my village?
The British Empire uprooted millions of men and women from the continent of Africa and deposited them on the island of Jamaica. Many of their descendants would mourn their loss of identity. Some would turn to a revolutionary movement that not only rejected empire, but holds its inheritors, like me, to account. Do you think the United Kingdom economy benefits from slavery?
You benefited from our labor.
I'm approaching a village called Pinnacle, and with this amazing panorama that's opened up over Kingston Harbour, the name is absolutely justified. It's not just a beauty spot, it's a revolutionary hub. One that rejected the British Empire and everything that it stood for. Before the Second World War, as the British Empire waned, a political movement grew up in Jamaica that looked to reach out to black people in Africa and elsewhere to throw off the legacy of enslavement. The Rastafari movement established a settlement at Pinnacle under the leadership of Leonard Howell, who's sometimes known as the first Rasta. He argued that black Africans are superior to white Europeans. To enter Pinnacle, I need permission from the Council of Elders. Africa Love, brother, thank you so much for your welcome here today to Pinnacle. Would it be possible for me to meet the elders as well, please?
Yes, man. It's possible.
Good.
It couldn't work without them. Resurrecting the name of Leonard P. Howell.
Yes.
And I'm happy to introduce real soldiers.
Brother?
For the rights.
My name is Michael. Brother, my name is Michael.
Bless up, man.
Leonard Howell's uncompromising anti-colonial message made an enemy of the authorities.
And that's Brother Constance.
Brother Constance, as did the settlement's use of cannabis, which they saw as a sacrament.
Brother I, the priest.
The elders provide a living link to Leonard Howell and his original settlement.
No, I am unknown Mr. Howell. Mr. Howell, in '54, he was raided here by the police. A lot of people go to prison. And they used to plant a lot of ganja here too. When you smoke those herbs, it gives you an inspiration. Police arrest him. They say they charge him for treason and then send him to prison. And many people here go to prison and scatter. I know a lot of them. He have the inspiration of Almighty, you know.
I'm invited to join the elders in a communal gathering overseen by Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. Ethiopia was seen as their African promised land, and its ruler, Haile Selassie, was hailed by the Rastafari as their king and biblical savior, their black messiah. In finding a new religion, they'd found a new politics too.
Leonard P. Howell said, look, I am looking for a God with new morality and new justice, because this existing system, giving its support to colonialism, slavery, and oppression, they cannot be our liberator.
I'm meeting Brother Louis, a Rastafari authority on Leonard Howell.
His approach to colonialism was not just a simple thing of getting rid of the colonial master. He went beyond it now and said, look, we need to build our own civilization.
By the wholesale rejection of British colonialism, the Rastafari were declaring independence.
These people were no longer British subjects now, They have a new identity.
The Rastafari looked to Africa to remake their identity. But thousands of Jamaicans made a different choice, voyaging instead to the very heart of empire. In June 1948, the Empire Windrush, a former troop carrier, steamed out of Kingston Harbour, bound for Tilbury, near London. On board were several hundred people who intended to settle in the United Kingdom. The British government was concerned about labour shortages and had granted citizenship to colonial subjects. The people of the British Empire were on the move again, but this time they were headed for Britain. In the coming years, identities would shift and be remade once more.
We became the black people of Britain, meaning like America had an African population, but England never really had an African population, so Jamaicans, I think, spearheaded that.
Sister Maxine from the Pinnacle community believes that Jamaica is still being exploited today.
What you're trying to keep is your economic system.
We are.
Yeah, the British are. Economically, if you look at the wealth of Jamaica, it goes abroad. The majority of Jamaicans migrate for better economic opportunity. Where is the growth if your educated masses leave?
Do you think the United Kingdom economy benefits from slavery?
You've benefited from our labor, because it's our labor. We didn't come here because of race. We came here because we could withstand the sun to grow the sugar. That was the cocaine of that time. You know what I mean? Because the sugar came into the human body and everybody wanted it. You know what I mean?
How would you express the legacy for you, for Jamaicans, of the British imperial experience?
With such a majority African population here, the majority of the economics is still held by the plantation class.
Even today?
Even today.
The capture in 1655 of a small island in the Caribbean set the British Empire on a path that would change the history of continents and the futures of millions, including the Britain that we call home today. In the next programme, I'm going to explore how the lure of Africa's wealth drew the empire into a shameful war. Surviving more than 100 years, original barbed wire, and a century of racial oppression.
The idea of subordinating black people and making them into a vassal class does not start after 1948.